Whether one is listening to this in Myanmar or from outside the country, we know it is a very difficult time for those of us who hold the Golden Land and its people in our hearts. In trying times like these, we can all use a bit more care and compassion in our lives. So on behalf of the team here at Insight Myanmar, I would like to say, in the traditional way metta is offered, may you be free from physical discomfort. May you be free from mental discomfort. May you not meet dangers or enemies. May you live a peaceful and happy life. And may all beings be free and come out of suffering. And with that, let's move on to the show. On this episode of Insight Myanmar podcast, we're talking to Mirka Knaster. We're going to be discussing mainly her book and her research around it. The name of the book is called Living This Life Fully, Stories and Teachings of Munindra. And the subject of this talk will be Munindra, will be a teacher, a meditator, someone who is, I think, very important and inspirational to share about for those meditators who don't already know him, as well as those people that are interested in Burma, Myanmar, and seeing where his life intersected with some things in that country. So we're going to be talking about this man, this book, and Mirka's work. So thanks so much for joining us to talk about your book.
Oh, thanks for inviting me.
So there's a lot to talk about with Munindra. He lived such a full life, as your title indicates, living this life fully, and touched upon so many different geographic places, historical eras, people who would become important in their life and intersect them in profound ways. So there's a lot to cover. But before we get into his later life and when he became somewhat more well-known in what he was doing, let's take it back from the beginning and tell us about his early life and where he came from.
Well, he was born in 1915 in a village in what was, at that time, East Bengal, and later became, after the partition, Bangladesh. And he was born into the Barua family, which was an ancient Buddhist clan that claim to have been descended from the Buddhist time, which is quite something. And they've kept up the Dharma all those many centuries. So he grew up with in a very loving family. His father became a monk, Sramanera, a novice monk initially. And unlike most monks, he did not leave the family and go live in a monastery. He still felt his responsibility as the head of the family and to take care of his family, his wife and his sons. Unfortunately, the village ostracized him and the family for that. But eventually things turned around, and the situation proved to be a really important lesson for Munindra, because he vowed for the rest of his life never to harm anyone else the way people were trying to harm them. And this was a vow that he made, and he kept it his whole life. So from a time of adversity, he turned it into an opportunity to be a better person. He left the village and went to Calcutta in 1936. Oh, and I should go back a moment and say that while he still lived in the village, he's just a very interesting character, because while most of us try to pass our exams as highly in the class, as high in the class as we can, even though Munindra was the top of his class, he actually refused to take exams. He made a decision that taking an exam and being the best was always going to keep him, in a sense, on a ladder, the next test, the next point to achieve. And that's not what he wanted to do. He wanted to dedicate his life to the Dharma, even from a young age, because his father had given him books, had read him stories about the Buddha. And from a young age, maybe even as early as 8 years old, Munindraji wanted to answer questions that arose in his mind hearing the story of the Buddha's life. So he purposely did not take the exams or fail the exams so that he wouldn't get on that path of achievement. He wanted his achievement to be in the Dharma. However, everybody recognized how smart he was, and even though he was so young, he became a school teacher in the village, and he taught the children there. He also had, I guess you could say, he had a scholarly bent from a very early age. He even built his own bookcase so that he could put books on the shelves. And every time there was the opportunity for a gift, he just wanted another book, as opposed to, oh, I don't know, they didn't have toy trucks in that village, but the kind of things that little boys might want. So this really showed from an early age. It's almost like it's hard to know how to understand karma. If you grow up in Asia, karma has to do with past lives and future lives. But in the West, we understand it more as what you do, even in this lifetime, from moment to moment, has an impact on the next moment or beyond that. Munindra, however, I know that his family and he himself talked about it. He believed in past lives. And so it's possible that he had a past life that predisposed him to the life that unfolded in the 20th century. Or you could call it fate or destiny. But from an early age, he showed an inclination to walk the path of Dharma and to not let anything else get in his way, including getting married. His parents arranged marriages were the thing. In some places it still is. But in his case, his parents made the arrangements when he was very young with a very young girl, and they would wait until the children had matured to get married, but they were, in a sense, betrothed. Munindra really didn't want to do this, and a very curious, devastating thing happened. The first girl, and I say girl, she was a girl, not a young woman, that he was betrothed to, had a really strange experience, and the details are in the book. And she died. And that really stirred Munindraji's mind, how fickle or how delicate life is. One moment somebody's here, and the next moment the person is gone. It really had a big impact on him. Well, they tried with 2 more girls, and again, devastatingly, those 2 girls died. At that point, his parents relented and allowed him to go to Calcutta and study. And that's where he joined the Mahabodhi Society.
Mm, right. So that's interesting look at his early life and coming from the Barua group in what's now Bangladesh. Do we know much about the nature of the type of Buddhism they practiced or believed or their ethnicity, as well as their community there? This is, as I understand, a minority group among in a largely Muslim area. I should mention, we've actually had a guest on the podcast who is from the Maramaji group. I'm not sure if you're familiar with them. The way he describes it, they're in Rakhine State. He describes Christopher Wynn is his name as being uh, ethnically linked to the Barua people, but they're on the Burmese side of the border. So through him, we were able to learn a bit about his community Buddhist practices and how different that is really from what you find with like Burmese Buddhists in among the Bamar people. But I wonder if you could tell us more about just the Barua people and this the community where he grew up.
Well, I didn't know about this other group that you're mentioning. What I do know is that because Buddhism basically faded away so many centuries ago in India, most of the practice was ritualistic and, lighting, creating an altar, putting fresh water and flowers and candles, and this was something that his mother did. His mother used to do every morning and every evening, and then they would bless the boys when they came home from school. What his father actually did, I don't know. I don't know whether there was any kind of meditation. I mean, one of the a main impetus for Munindraji to go to Burma was to learn meditation, to practice. There was nobody in India at the time, according to him, that could teach him in that way. So my sense is that a certain amount of tradition had been carried forth, but not the practice as we know it from the 20th century on. And even in Burma, it wasn't until at some point in the 19th century that meditation was shared with the laity. I think, you know, I remember when I was in Burma and I went to the big main temple in Yangon, that people were coming and they weren't practicing meditation. They were doing rituals. It's kind of like, people who don't go to synagogue all year, but then they go on the holidays, or they don't go to mass every morning, but they show up for Christmas Eve mass at the church. Um, Beyond that, I don't really know what they did, and I don't even know that monks were meditating, because when he went to Calcutta and eventually wound up in Burma, when he came back from Burma, he was teaching.
Mm.
So that's as far as I know about the family. And you do know about Deepama, the other well-known
Yeah.
teacher from Bengal. She was also a Barua.
Yeah, very interesting stuff. And on our podcast discussion with Christopher Wynn, he talked about having a vague familiarity with both Deepama and Munindra, just with the
Mm-hmm.
shared ethnic connection they have across borders and being interested in this little known ethnic group and what and these kind of representatives that would go on to.
I'm just going to interrupt you for one moment because I remembered something. Remember, I told you his mother took care of the rituals in the household. Much, much later, when Munindraji was allowed to cross the border into East Bengal, he had not seen his mother for decades. He went back to the village in order to teach Vipassana to his mother. So nobody had been doing that for a very long time.
Great. Yeah. So going back to where we left off in his story, you have him now on his way to Calcutta before going further to Burma. Pick it up from there.
So he was in Calcutta, and he was working with the Mahabodhi Society. And then, because they saw how diligent and honest and dedicated he was, they sent him to Sarnath. And he was there for 10 years. He took care of the library. He took care of guests who showed up, including Gandhi and Nehru. He did whatever he could do to foster the Dharma in Sarnath. And again, because they trusted him so much, in 1948, there were relics that were returned, Buddhist relics, and they wound up sending a delegation carrying these relics around to Sikkim and up to Tibet and so on. And he was part of that delegation. And it was on that trip. And by the way, I described the trip. It was a real highlight in his life. Munindraji was such a curious person. He wanted to learn. He wanted to go and see. There was nothing that didn't capture his attention in a wholesome way. His curiosity was, it was wholesome in that he just wanted to know, even though he came from this little village. And by the way, that village, there was a cluster of villages, some Hindu, some Muslim, and Buddhist. And according to Munindraji, they all lived together very harmoniously. There wasn't a problem until the partition. That's when the trouble started. But they had all been living together in a very neighborly way. They played together, they went to school together, and so on. Anyway, so he went off with this delegation, and this meant trekking in the Himalayas through snow 3 feet deep or higher, and eventually meeting His Holiness the Dalai Lama. That was just, he was so thrilled to be able to do that, just absolutely thrilled. And he stayed in touch with the Dalai Lama all the times that the Dalai Lama used to come from Bodh Gaya. Then he and Munindraji would get together. And so, by the way, the Dalai Lama at the time was maybe 15 years old.
Right.
Yeah. And they met at a temple which the Dalai Lama and his entourage had gone to because of course, Chinese problems, Chinese violence in the at the main temple. So he did that, and they went to Burma as well, and it was from 1950 to 1951. After that, in 1953, and he stayed until 1957, he was assigned to be the first Buddhist superintendent of the Mahabodhi Temple since the 12th century. All this time, it had been run by Hindus, and so Hindu practices were carried out there. But if I remember correctly, and I don't remember his name, it was a British archaeologist who discovered that it was not a Hindu temple, but it was a Buddhist temple. And so he was put in charge of the Mahabodhi Temple in Bodh Gaya, which you could say Bodh Gaya is the navel of the Buddhist universe, because that's where the Buddha sat under the Bodhi tree and had his awakening. He had a yeoman's job there. There was a community of potters. that used one area as a latrine, and he tried to get the officials to remove the potters, give them another place to live so he could clean up the grounds. There were so many things that had to be done, fixed and cleaned up, and he put in irrigation. He just did everything he could to make it a nicer place to visit, because now pilgrims could come knowing that this was the Mahabodhi temple. And he ran into quite a number of difficulties, but Munindraji was absolutely fearless when it came to the Dharma. I mean, even though there's a word in India, you say gunda, and it's like a goon or a tough guy, someone that you wanted to steer, a hooligan, someone you wanted to steer clear of. And he had to be really careful. There were people who actually warned him, don't go there at night, don't do this, don't do that. Those hooligans, those gundas are going to come after you. Mm-hmm. But he felt protected by the Dharma. Mm-hmm. So anyway, what happened was Prime Minister of Burma came. Now things were set up for pilgrims to come. Mm-hmm. And he made such a huge effort because he felt ashamed that people would come and it would be such a trash site. And he was embarrassed for the place, for the country. And so he did his utmost to make things better. Anyway, the Prime Minister of Burma came and invited him to come to Burma.
This is UNU.
Yeah. And Munindraji decided, anybody can come and be superintendent. This is an opportunity I cannot pass up. So he left his position after he did the major cleanup, and he went to Burma in 1957, and he stayed until 1966. And there he practiced under the guidance of Mahasi Sayadaw, and he also studied the Pali canon. And by the way, he accomplished going through the Pali canon in 5 years. It ordinarily took 15 years. He studied from first thing in the morning till late at night, just stopping to eat and sleep. And he had Umang Mong was his scholarly tutor. And so between practice and scholarship, he became very adept. He did achieve the first stage of awakening. And I have to say, I don't know how many more stages he achieved. And I'll tell you why. I don't know how it is in other traditions, but in the Burmese tradition, you don't go around bragging what you've achieved. Sure. You just, it's not an ego trip. You just stay quiet. If people ask you, you don't even say. You obliquely make some kind of comment in order to answer the question. And so I don't really know. I just know that the way he described that experience, it had to be the first stage. But I don't know about other stages. In any case, Burma was an extraordinary experience for him, and he became a teacher there. There was a Bengali community, and they many of them didn't know how to understand Mahasi Sayadaw when he was giving a Dharma talk. So he was called in to translate, and then he wound up teaching people. Then he was offered citizenship in Burma, but he decided he needed to bring the Dharma back to India, where it had first arisen. And he felt a huge obligation or responsibility after he had been treated so generously in Burma. He felt he needed to bring this forward, bring it into India, which is why so many Westerners wound up learning Vipassana, because he was in Bodh Gaya from 1966 to 1977 teaching. People, Westerners showed up from Europe, from Canada, Australia, South America, United States, and many of them became teachers. Joseph Goldstein, Sharon Salzberg, or they took on other roles like Daniel Goleman, the psychologist, and so on. So he was very important in bringing the Dharma to India. And then from India, it was conveyed all over the world through his students. And I'm saying students and not disciples, because Munindraji never set himself up as a guru. He didn't believe in that for himself anyway. He considered himself a Kalyanamitta, which is a spiritual friend. And he taught in that way. I will say he did spend some time in Burma as a monk, and he asked Mahasi Sayadaw permission to disrobe so he could go back to India. And he felt that as a monk, his ability to teach would be very limited. Number one, there was no, how shall I put it, institutional support. In Burma, the monks get up in the morning and they make their rounds and they get food, but he couldn't do that in India. There was no Buddhist community to support him. So he felt that being a Kalyanamitta, being an Anāgārika, which means homeless one. So he was somewhere between being a monk and a householder. He never established a household. He never got married, but he also wasn't a monk. And so in between, he was an Anāgārika, and this allowed him to interact with men and women, to teach young and old, and to go to places and do things that monks would not be able to. So that was a very, how shall I say, a very considered decision on his part, because he wanted to be able to share the Dharma as widely as possible. And so that's what he did in Bodh Gaya. And he became a really important and vital model of how to integrate practice in daily life, because he was someone who lived daily life. He wasn't sequestered in a monastery. And after that, from 1977 on, he was invited by his many Western students, and he traveled to the US and Europe and Australia, teaching everywhere he went.
So just to take a moment to look at the kind of spiritual status or identification he came to take on, I understand why he stepped down from being a monk after leaving Burma. Just the infrastructure wasn't there, and it's more rigid in terms of what you can and can't do, and this religious identification. But if you could explain the other way, why would he choose to remain in Anāgārika? What benefit did that give him? What structures did he have to live by, rather than just simply becoming a layperson?
Well, in a sense, an Anāgārika is a layperson. And for him, well, first there was, in a lot of ways, Munindraji was an adventurous person. Making the decision to be an Anāgārika meant he, in a sense, threw himself on the goodness or generosity of the world, because He had no income. He had no uh, he had no home. He had no money to buy a house or anything like that. But he chose to be homeless. And he used to tell his students, they'd say, "Oh, aren't you happy to be back in Calcutta with your family?" And he'd say, uh, "Everywhere I go, I have a home." He just felt at home throughout the world. In any case, he felt that this would be the best way for him to teach, even though there were a lot of risks. Would he have a place to sleep? Would he have food? Would he able to maintain his body and mind without earning any money? And he never asked for any money, but people would give him dana. They would make donations to him. In fact, there was one story. So there was Munindraji. Everybody who came to see him, he was hugely, hugely generous. Whoever showed up, he would give them fruit or whatever he had. And there were all of these Westerners, and one day it hit Joseph Goldstein. Here we all are coming from a wealthy nation. None of us is poor, or we wouldn't have been able to even get over here. And here's Munindraji feeding everybody. So he went up to Munindraji and he said, shouldn't we be giving you some money? Shouldn't we be helping you in some way? And Munindraji said, whatever you feel comfortable with. I mean, he never asked anybody for anything. He just let it happen. His whole approach was let it happen. He didn't beg for money. He didn't beg for dana. And so they started giving him money, and that helped him to continue. And this happened locally as well, because in India, people understood about making donations. The Westerners did not, but they learned. They learned, and they helped to take care of him.
Yeah, very interesting. And I want to spend some time about Munindra's years in Burma before we get back to going to India and the Western disciples, students that he came in contact with are some of whom are big names today. Before spending time looking at that relationship, I want to understand better about these years in Burma. And it sounds like he continues to meet a high caliber of people. He's Unu brings him there. You mentioned Umang Maung, who is his personal tutor. He would go on to become a president of Burma. He associates with Mahasi Sayadaw, one of the great monks and meditation masters at the time. And so I'm curious if you could flesh out some of those years that he spent in Burma, looking at the kinds of practices he dedicated himself to. We know Mahasi primarily, but if there were other teachers or techniques or traditions that he explored, as well as just how all of those years in Burma would have profoundly changed him.
Well, yes, Mahasi Sayadaw was his preceptor, and he was eternally grateful to him. In fact, he had a piece of cloth that Mahasi Sayadaw had given him, and he always put that piece of cloth down before he started to meditate. It was a connection to his teacher. He, as I said earlier, was an extremely curious, interested, exploring, investigative kind of person. And so after he had studied with Mahasi Sayadaw, he asked him for permission, and Mahasi Sayadaw gave him permission to go to other centers. And it turned out, I'm not sure if I have the number right, but I think there were 48 other techniques that he could engage in. So he went to these different centers, learned these different techniques, didn't necessarily, he didn't shift. and continue only in another tradition. He stayed with the Mahasi way, but learning all of these different ways enabled him to be a much better teacher. He could discern in a student what that person needed, and maybe doing something that he was teaching was not exactly what the person needed in that moment, and he could guide the person to do something else. So, in a sense, you could say he had a bigger bag of tricks that helped him as a teacher. It also made him even more open-minded than he already was. He was not someone to cling to his students and to say, oh, you can only practice with me, or you must only do it this way. He wasn't even about allowing. Students would come and say, oh, I heard about such and such a teacher, or I heard about such and such a method. And Munindraji would say, oh, go and learn for yourself, go and try it out for yourself. And then he would want the person to come back and relate to him how it was. He just wanted to know how people were doing, and he didn't feel like he was losing students by sending them to someone else. In Burma, he became very good friends with S.N. Goenka. He would go over there and have meals with the family. And then later, when Goenka-ji came to India, Munindra-ji sent him student after student for his retreats. And so I feel there was no clinging. The main point is not to cling, not to be attached. And Munindra-ji really exemplified this by sending his students to other teachers, or if they requested, oh, what about this, what about that? He'd said, yeah, go ahead. And one student actually asked him one day, Munindra-ji, aren't you my guru? And he said, I am nobody's guru. He's just Kalyana Mitta, and you can go and study with anyone you want. Go and derive benefit from anyone. So I think that his experience in Burma really enabled him to be even more broad-minded and open-hearted, and this was a great example to his students. I think about Joseph. He wrote a book called One Dharma, and this was after experiencing so many different techniques and practices. And even though Munindraji was his first teacher and taught him in the Mahasi method, Mahasi way. So I think this had a big impact on him. The other thing that happened in Burma was this ability to study the entire Pali canon so thoroughly, so minutely, that it became imprinted on his very being. Didn't matter whom he spoke with over the decades. If you said X, he could come out and with a quote from a sutta or from the Abhidhamma or from any part of the Tipitaka. And he was a walking encyclopedia of the Dhamma. This helped a lot of people. In fact, when he was in India and used to stay with Goenka-ji at Igatpuri in Dhamma Giri, and they walked together, they were always discussing the fine points of the Pali Canon. And when he was in residence there, Munindraji was basically the scholar in residence. If anyone had a question about something, that person would be sent to Munindraji to explain, because he so thoroughly knew what the Buddha had taught. So those are two examples of how being in Burma had a huge impact, not only on his own life, but on all the people he came into contact with. He said that the reason he was able to study so diligently, so thoroughly in those 5 years, he felt as though the Buddha was there in the room with him. And that because of the experience he had had practicing under Mahasi Sayadaw, he had that, how do I say, it was in his body. I mean, it was he had the experience in his body. So then when he was when he was studying the Pali Canon, he understood it because he had the experiential background as a foundation for understanding.
That's very interesting, and a lot of different threads that I want to pull from that discussion of his time in Burma. I want to start with his association with S.N. Goenka and Sayadaw Bakin, and the places where they intersected, and also the places where perhaps they diverged, and understand a bit in those divergences how they might have seen things differently, and yet their Dhamma friendship and their connection seems to have been strong throughout it. And that's that you describe this kind of unquenchable thirst for an interest in wanting to learn to know more, and this, and both within the Dhamma and outside the Dhamma, but within the Dhamma in Myanmar, how that leads him to going to different teachers, practicing different techniques, learning different things himself, so he can then teach different things. Very eclectic, very flexible, very open in terms of what he was able to absorb and take in. And when you look at the methodology and the program of S.N. Goenka and Sayadaw Bakin, you have a very different way they approach the Dhamma in terms of having a singular technique and cautioning students not to sample other practices, that this will confuse them, that it's important to really dedicate to dig a hole, and not just dig a whole bunch of holes in different places, but to dig one hole and diligently continue working on that particular hole without kind of going here and going there, as an analogy that Goenka's used. And so in your study and analysis of his life, and was being around him and the many people that you talked to, how did you see this kind of divergence playing out in terms of the way that the Dhamma was approached by these individuals, as well as what impact or effect that had on their relationship, on their mission, and how perhaps maybe they even talked about that with each other, the different ideas they had of how one should approach the practice?
Well, they considered each other Dhamma brothers. And, you can grow up in a family and siblings are very different from each other. And they grew up in the family of Dhamma, but they had different personalities. And I think this is just my own interpretation. Munindraji had his quirky, open-minded, spirited, curious personality, and Goenkaji had his own personality. He had been a businessman before, and I don't know whether that influenced how he did things, or because of his learning from Sayadaw Bakin and his gratitude for, in a sense, saving his life because of the horrible migraines that he had. So I personally think it's a matter of different personalities. And I think about people who are drawn to Zen, think about people who are drawn to Tibetan Buddhism, and other people who are drawn to the Theravadan tradition. For whatever reason, a different tradition speaks to us. A different technique speaks to us. And I'm not going to psychoanalyze these two fabulous teachers.
Mm.
Goenka, I did my very first 10-day Vipassana retreat, my first, second, third retreats with him. And it had a huge impact on my life. Huge. I remember after my first retreat at Dhamma Giri, I started to see my life as BV and AV, before Vipassana and after Vipassana, and I'm eternally grateful to him. I didn't stay only with his technique. I still know how to do it, but I didn't stay only with that. And again, I think it's an individual path that we all take.
Yeah, and the question's not coming so much from an interest in psychoanalyzing them. It's more that these are two paradigms that I think continue to impact the meditation, Buddhist, Dhamma communities today. These two very different ways of approaching it, which has impacted thousands of students, if not millions, in terms of should one approach this path through dedicating a particular lineage or teaching and not stepping outside of that, not exploring or
Mm.
being creative or playful, but really just dedicating to one tradition technique only and going deep into that without being distracted or confused, as they might say. Or on the other hand, an eclectic approach where one is sampling this and that and these different kinds of practices, and maybe even being loose with what's within a Buddhist framework and being more flexible and open and creative and playful. And it's not black and white. There's a lot of shades of gray in there, different phases one might go through. But I think what's so interesting to me is seeing how the mindfulness movement, meditation movement has developed over the years, and kind of what categories have become ossified of that were a bit more flexible before, and especially once we get to the period in the 1970s in Bodh Gaya, the spiritual communities that formed there that were quite amorphous and flexible before some of these categories came in, is that there is this distinction of communities now of people that are more open and practicing different things, and people that are really just and largely in the Goenka tradition, really just sticking with one thing and one thing only. And it's so interesting to think of these classifications that have become ossified and taken shape, that you actually had them personified in a very rich and warm and close Dhamma friendship, that
Yeah.
perhaps even where these categories and classifications came from, that you had these two very close Dhamma friends that really loved and supported and encouraged each other. And yet their approaches were so different that didn't impact their friendship, but it did seem to impact these communities that have grown up since.
I don't know what to say about that, except that some people are drawn to flexibility and some people need things to be more highly structured. I can't, I'm not going to weigh in on what's better. I just think we're so many, all of us are so different, and we need to do whatever works for us. If it works for us to try different things and maybe come to the thing that eventually clicks the best, why not? If it works for us to stay within the bounds of a particular structure, then so be it. I think that Munindraji and Goenkaji as Dhamma brothers exemplify something very important, which is sorely lacking, especially in these times. And that is, why can't we embrace our differences? Why can't we be friendly despite our differences? Why do we have to fight over them? Why does one of them have to be right and one of them has to be wrong? That's the part that the fact that they could maintain their friendship, even though they had these personality and experiential differences, represents a model that we would do well to follow.
And right, I think one of the interesting things in looking at this relationship now, of course, is that sometimes students might not necessarily be making their own decisions or their own agency in which they're pursuing. You fall into a community or into a certain teaching or a culture, and that conditions the way you start to see what practice should be. I mean, I know that was definitely my case of doing many years of a certain type of practice before I went to Burma, and then in Burma realizing the conditioning of that had gone into the practice that I took on. And uh, my many years in Burma started to expose some of that. But then as I stayed longer in Burma, I saw the conditioning there. So, sometimes just the community or the practice or the culture you fall into starts to influence you in ways that can take quite some time to unravel and untangle.
Right, and what you're talking about is basically that each one of us has our own path,
Hmm.
our own, our own evolution or development in the Dhamma. And who's to say how someone should do it? Sometimes we have to go through a lot of ups and downs, and until we are able to discern more clearly what really is best for us or what is most wholesome, most skillful. And I don't think that trying different things is a bad thing because it's how we learn.
So, staying with his time in Burma, we've talked a bit about his relationship with SN Goenka. Perhaps if you can touch upon what connection he had with Sayadaw Buken, who was Goenka's teacher, as well as Mahasi Sayadaw, and get into that relationship.
I don't know. Um, I don't know how much of a relationship he had with Upakin. I think he did meet him. He did try it, but I don't know how long he stayed with that. Mahasi Sayadaw was his preceptor, so his main connection was with Mahasi. And I imagine Goenkaji was very happy that Munindraji did practice with his teacher, but I have no idea beyond that. I don't know how much time they spent together.
Right. And then looking at Mahasi Sayadaw, this was his preceptor, his main, as I understand it, his main meditation practice, even though he had permission to explore many other techniques. But what do you know about his his practice of meditation with Mahasi, as well as the relationship with the man himself, and how he was influenced by that?
Well, he felt enormously grateful to his teacher. And when his teacher came to the United States, Munindraji was there by his side. Mahasi Sayadaw is in the middle of the photo. Munindraji is on his right side. And there are two other people there, and I'm not sure who they are, but this was in 1977. Um, you know, if you have the kind of opening that Munindraji had practicing under Mahasi Sayadaw, this is a very, very deep connection to your teacher. That your teacher was able to guide you to take that step on the path to awakening. So, and as I mentioned, he had a cloth from his teacher, and he never failed to put that cloth down for his meditation. So that's what I know about his connection to Mahasi Sayadaw. what kind of conversations they had or anything like that. I don't know. But I imagine that because Munindraji was eager to explore, and Mahasi Sayadaw was lenient enough, willing to give him permission to go explore, and then later to understand why Munindraji wanted to disrobe, I just imagine a very close, warm connection between the two of them, that there was great understanding between the two of them. Not every teacher will say, yeah, go do this or go do that, or no, you can't disrobe. You need to stay a monk. So I imagine they had a warm and cordial relationship of understanding. Beyond that, I don't know, because I'm trying to remember. I never met Mahasi Sayadaw. I met his disciple I went to retreats with Upandita.
Mm-hmm.
So Upandita, and here's another example. Upandita and Munindraji were disciples of Mahasi Sayadaw at the same time. And I think there was a third person. I don't remember who that is. And look at how different Upandita and Munindraji were, even though they came from the same teacher.
Yeah.
Again, it has to do with personality.
Mm-hmm.
Sayadaw Upandita just had enormous organizational skills, was able to accomplish so much.
Mm-hmm.
Munindraji didn't have that kind of, let's see, I don't know if it's skill or push, to establish structures. Like Sayadaw Upandita had the center in Rangoon, and I did a retreat at the Forest Refuge. He accomplished a lot in that regard. Munindraji was not that kind of personality. He was more free-floating.
That's very interesting. Going off that last conversation, it's interesting thinking about this and realizing that how the personality intertwines with the Dhamma. And I think that sometimes when we have a teacher or a guide, it can be hard to separate the inspiration we get from their Dhamma practice with who they are as a person, which might not be who we are as a person. And so being able to be inspired and learn from the Dhamma practice that's being given, but then to find a way to fully integrate it without mimicking or imitation of another personality, and to have it embody something who we really are, even if that's categorically different than the teacher or the tradition or the culture that is bringing that to us.
Exactly. And do you know that Burmese expression? I may not paraphrase it exactly, but it goes something like this. The bottle is empty, but the perfume is still there. And basically, it means you can be free, empty of greed, hatred, and delusion. You may have achieved all 4 stages of awakening, but the perfume is still there. You're still a human being with a personality. So no matter how much you have attained in the Dhamma, you still have a personality. And that personality may be something you sync with, or maybe you don't, but you can appreciate the teachings that come from that individual.
Right. Yeah, that's well said.
I find I have to discern between maybe something I don't click with in a teacher's personality and what that person is still able to convey. Because there's that you don't know why sometimes you don't feel connected to a person, or you do feel connected to a person. And so you have to pause, even if I don't feel connected to that personality, can I still learn here?
Mm-hmm.
Or will that get in the way of my learning? And we go through different stages on the path of Dhamma. When I think of where I was on my first retreat with Goenka, and by the way, at that time, Dhamma Giri was barely constructed. We had dirt floors, we had no showers, it was very, very, very rudimentary at that time, very basic. And where I was as an individual, as a young woman, to where I am now, I mean, I understand things about Dhamma that I couldn't at that time, with all the stuff that I was carrying with me. And yet he was the perfect teacher for me at that time.
Right. And going back to Munindra's actual practice in the technique Goenka slash Ubekin, it's my understanding that Ubekin declined to teach him when he was in Yangon because he was a monk, and Ubekin was sensitive about the criticism he would receive of a layperson teaching a monastic, but that when Munindra disrobed, went back to being an Anagarika, went to India and wanted to learn from Goenka, Goenka had asked permission from Ubekin to teach him, and said, "Yes, sure, go ahead."
Yes, I'm now. Thank you for bringing that up. I'm now remembering that. I had forgotten about that part. That he did not study with Ubekin in Burma. Yeah. People. There's a certain etiquette that people follow to not step on other people's toes. So that makes a lot of sense what you're saying.
And before we move to his return to India, which is another very important time in his life and the influences he had there, just one last question on Burma. I'm curious if you found how just simply the experience of being in Burma changed him. I mean, even today, for myself, as well as many other foreign meditators, practitioners, monastics that spend time in Burma, away from the actual practice, the teachings, the particular technique that's being taught, the mere experience of being in Buddhist Burma, being around Burmese monastics and lay supporters in the culture, that itself can be transformative. And so I'm wondering if he gave any indication or talked about his experience of the time in Burma, which, beyond the specific association with a type of teacher or a technique he was practicing, just the experience of being in Burma, if he referenced how that had an impact on him.
He did. In fact, I guess the way a good example might be, so when he was leaving Burma to return to India, there were like 27 crates of books, Dhamma books. And the military didn't allow anyone to take anything out of the country. And everybody warned him, you can't do this, they won't let you. He said, oh, I'll go and see them myself. He never let anything get in his way. He was fearless in that regard. And he went to see he went through the first guard and the second guard and the third guard, and each time exclaiming how Burma was his country as well, that Burma, the people, the culture, the Dhamma that he got there, they were like a mother to him. And so the first guard allowed him to go to the second guard, and he told the same story. And then he finally went to the third guard, and everybody was, I guess, impressed with how they were struck by his incredible sincerity about what Burma meant to him, how Burma changed his life, and that he was forever grateful, and that because of that, he needed to bring the Dhamma from Burma back to India. So the military had, I guess they had a committee meeting or something, and they eventually, not only did they allow him to bring the books back, they helped him pack the crates. It just goes to show how much he conveyed about the importance of Burma to his life.
Mm-hmm.
And so and hundreds of people came to see him off on the ship. He felt like he was leaving his place, his home. He also felt how important it was, the responsibility that he had to bring the Dhamma back to India. So those 9 years in Burma were transformative, no way about it. Imagine you come from India, where you're only part of this little group, the Mahabodhi Society, and you land in a country where everything is Buddhist, where every person is maybe not practicing in the way he learned how to practice, but there was a reverence for the Buddha, the Sangha, and everywhere you turned, there's a temple, there's a ritual, there's the monks are walking at dawn through a community and being given rice, and just watching how families, they didn't start out with meditation the way Westerners did. They started out with dana. They would hold their small children and teach the child how to give rice to the monks that were passing by. That was the first thing they learned, not how to sit in meditation. So being in this kind of atmosphere, he was soaked. He was soaked in Dhamma. And that was a very big deal, a really, really big deal. And he carried that with him ever after.
That's really beautiful. And now we have him going back to India. This is an incredible moment to spend some time reflecting on, because you have this confluence of events that are all happening in this time and space that one could scarcely script out if you were trying, of in terms of Munindra's life and the greater forces in the world at that time. You look at Munindra's life, and at this point, he's resisted the marriage offers of his parents were trying to impose on him, went down a scholarly path, went to Bodh Gaya, from there went to Burma, and he has this Rolodex, you can say, of very important figures, both worldly and spiritual, and he himself has dedicated himself to the scholastic and practical sides of the Dhamma and become very renowned in his knowledge and his wisdom, and is now going back to India to want to bring the Dhamma there. But of course, this is a period where the counterculture movement in the West, the hippies, are taking off. They're seeking something beyond their own materialistic culture, looking for answers elsewhere. This is also when Goenka's mission really is starting in its full force. His mission also coincides with this counterculture movement, and Munindra falls right in the middle of that, in these worldly events that are going on, but also in his own life. This is where his own trajectory has led him to this point as well. And so pick up from there and describe what awaited for him as he left Burma after these 9 years, with these great crates of books that the military not only permitted, but actually packaged for him. And he now finds himself back in India.
Yes, I think you said something used an important word. You couldn't have scripted this. The fact that Westerners were In those days, you could go overland through Afghanistan to India, and a lot of young people were doing that. They were moving through Europe and then all the way through Afghanistan to get to India. And remember also, the younger generation was absolutely disgusted with the lies that government told them about Vietnam and other things. So where were they going to find some truth? Everybody was seeking. Not everybody, but many of us were seeking. And also religion, traditional religion, institutionalized religion, held no allure. Some people chanced upon Asian philosophy courses and, oh, this sounds really interesting, and decided to go to India. Or in Joseph's case, he was in the Peace Corps to Thailand, and Sharon went to India after taking a course. And it was just a big opening. People were being exposed to things that they hadn't been before, and that previous generations had shown no interest in. So all these young people were showing up in India. And they happened on Munindraji in Bodh Gaya. At first, he was staying in the Gandhi ashram. He had a room, and he, just managed very, very simple life. Maybe somebody said, oh, well, you could go speak to this guy, or, he was friendly, so he would meet people. And, because of his openness, the fact that these young Westerners were hippies, the way they dressed, the way they did things, the way they were doing drugs, and, maybe dressing not modestly like you're supposed to in India, he didn't judge them. He saw through all of that, and he could invite them, talk with them, teach them. So he was in the right place at the right time, and they showed up in the right place at the right time. And that's how it all started. So many people, not just Joseph and Sharon, but Ram Dass and so many people who are well known today came through and learned from him.
Yeah, that's remarkable. I know we've interviewed some of the same people, some of the people you've interviewed for your book we had on our podcast, such as Graham White, Barry Lapping, Michael Stein,
Mm-hmm.
among others. And what I find interesting is when I've asked them separately in separate interviews about their time in Bodh Gaya in India, their relationship with some of the spiritual teachers, including Munindra and Goenka, they've actually used the exact same language and analogy in describing their relationship to these two teachers. Independently, they've used this. And so I want to share that with you and get your thoughts on unpacking why they would phrase it this way. They would describe it as Munindra was like your mother and Goenka was like your father. So how do you understand that, them characterizing the relationship as
Yeah,
such?
people have said that. I think it's because Munindraji, some people described him as motherly, and other people described him as neither male nor female, but somewhere in between. Kind of androgynous. He was motherly in the sense that when you met him, the first thing he did was ask how you are. He wanted to take care of your physical needs first. And he would give you food. He acted in a motherly way. He had a very sweet, generous nature, and he looked after his students the way a mother would. I remember Goenkaji as having a strong, booming voice when he chanted. It was fabulous. I remember I could feel the vibrations in my body when he chanted. And so he had this strong, masculine presence. And I don't know whether people distinguish mother as, I don't know, maybe more lenient, and father is more disciplinarian. Maybe that's the way people think of it. I don't know. But he just had this really sweet, kind, generous nature, and he never yelled at anybody. He didn't have a big, powerful voice the way Goenka did. In fact, one of the things I'm trying to remember, one of the students said to me, you know, he would come into the room and you wouldn't feel it. But when a powerful teacher came into the room, you could feel the disturbance in the air. You could feel the movement in the air.
Mm-hmm.
So they were different physically, and they were different personality-wise. But many people commented on how caring Munindra was, like a mother. In fact, there's one monk, two monks in particular, who said he was like a mother to me, because this monk had come from Vietnam, and he didn't have any means, and Munindra made sure to share his food with him, and later to get funds for him to be able to stay and practice.
It's really beautiful, and it's also making me think how I've heard some Western practitioners share a concern that because they're coming from lay life into a monastic practice, whether they're a meditator or a monastic, just kind of moving away from worldly relationships, that sometimes their interactions with Buddhist monks, especially, and nuns that are from native Buddhist cultures in Asia, that there's kind of a softness or an affectionate nature of relations that they don't really sense because they've been in robes for all their life. So they've these kind of social engagements which bind us together, they don't have so much because they've been on that path for so long. They might have extraordinary metta. I've heard friends of mine share the tremendous spiritual metta and force and vibration that some of these teachers have. But then in personal interactions, there's something they feel that's kind of missing or different or a divergence. This is not to make a blanket statement at all. I've met some tremendous monks and nuns in Burma that would not fit the description at all. They've been lifelong monks and nuns, and yet they don't just have a spiritual metta, but they also have this wealth of how one interacts socially in a way that just brings everyone in and makes you feel connected and loved in this powerful way. Although there is the experience of those that fall outside of that. And so I mentioned that dynamic because it's very interesting in your description of why Munindra was motherly, that it sounds like he had both of these qualities. He had both the spiritual quality of the metta, which could be sent in special ways to support someone going through a difficult time or undergoing practice, and yet it wasn't limited to that. It was also in a very personal way to people that perhaps had no interest in the Dhamma and never practiced and never would, but would still feel some kind of personal connection or charisma, and even love or affection being drawn to him just being in the same room.
Yes, and again, that is why he became an Anāgārika and didn't stay a monk, because he wanted to be able to, or he needed to be able to deal with people on multiple levels, not just teaching in a meditation hall. When Jack Angler came to India to do research for his PhD, the first thing Munindraji asked him, and Jack had just traveled, oh my gosh, probably plane and train and bus and rickshaw, and it was a very, very long journey in those days. And the first thing Munindraji asked Jack Angler, how are your bowel movements? And he was so taken aback because he thought, even though I'm so tired, let's get going on the research right away, And Munindraji was, no, first we have to take care of your body, and then we'll move on to the work. And so he was very conscientious about health and hygiene, and not just for himself, but for the people he came into contact with. He would never have been able to offer food or do other things if he had been a monk. There was one fellow, he wasn't sure, he may have had, some people think he may have had cholera. Anyway, he was in such a bad way. In the middle of the night, Munindra got a rickshaw and started taking him around to doctors to help him. A monk couldn't do that. And how many teachers could do that or would do that? They might have an assistant do it, or they might just leave it to the person.
Right.
But Munindraji was so kindly and caring in that way. His metta was unbelievable. And when some of the students talked about how if you were just in his presence, it was like a blast of metta hit you. And this was with everyone. He didn't. I think it was his nephew who had said to me that, he had two nephews, and one of them said to me, my uncle never discriminated. He was just the same kindness and to everybody, the same metta to everybody, whether you were a rickshaw puller or, you were a Dhamma student. Metta was for everyone.
Right. And as he starts to come into contact with more of these Western students, this is, again, where we have to look at this divergence in his spiritual and Dhamma friendship with Goenka, where as Goenka was setting up his early mission, and that included not just a lineage, a meditation technique, an administration in terms of how these courses were offered, a protocol, everything that went into that, it seems that Munindra couldn't have been more opposite this, that he was, you mentioned before, he didn't even want to see himself as a teacher. He was a spiritual friend or guide, motherly. And yet, Joseph Goldstein, for one, although he did practice, he did take courses with Goenka, he came to see himself somewhat as a student of Munindra, and talked about him, I believe, as one of his teachers as he started to go forth in his own teaching career.
He presented a certain model that really influenced a lot of teachers. He expressed confidence in his students, even when they didn't have confidence in themselves. And because of that, their own confidence grew. He wasn't strict in the sense of, you have to do this. You can't move, you can't whatever. He just let his students progress at their own pace. He always had some vega, the sense of spiritual urgency, and he tried to convey that to people. But he would push only so far, only so that only to the point of being effective. He also saw that, students they come with different backgrounds, they come with different baggage. And if you are a striver, having somebody really push you again and again to the edge is not the best way. So he tempered the way he taught with everybody according to their needs. And he entrusted people early on when he saw that when they could articulate the Dhamma, that they'd had enough experience, he would put them in his place. In other words, Alan Clemens, he was a monk at the time. He had been practicing with Mahasi, and he was with Munindraji at a dinner, I believe it was in Calcutta. And it was appropriate to, at that point, for the teacher to give a talk. And he pointed to Alan to give the talk. And as Alan said, I was sweating bullets. I'd never given a Dhamma talk. What was Munindraji doing? And he said to Munindraji, first, like, you're the teacher. And he said, and guess what? I don't speak Bengali. So Munindraji pointed to himself and he said, oh, no better translator, And so he put Alan in this position of, go ahead, do it. He trusted him that he could do it. He had the confidence in him. And he did this with various students. Even though they didn't feel they were ready, he saw something in them, and he, in a sense, imbued his own confidence in them for them to develop self-confidence. So Alan said, that was my first ever Dhamma talk, and I was correct before, but thank you, Munindraji, for setting me on the path. So he had this uncanny way of, on the outside, you could look at what he was doing and think, oh, so laissez-faire. But he was not negligent. He was not ignorant of what he was doing. He saw something in people. There was a couple that came to see him in Bodh Gaya, or maybe they were in Calcutta too. I don't remember now. Anyway, and he sent them to Burma. He said, "Oh, you need to go to Burma and do this retreat." And the fellow said, "Oh no, I can't even sit here for 10 minutes. How can I go and do that?" "Oh no, yes you can. I'm sure you can. You'll do it." And so, buoyed on Munindraji's enthusiasm and confidence in them, they went to Burma to do a retreat.
Wow.
And it was a very intense retreat. I think it was in Mahasi. But that's what he did. He just infused people with his own, in a sense, his own saddha, his own faith and confidence in the Dhamma. He did that a lot. And he also, because he didn't set up these very strict 10-day retreats, some people would be disappointed if he didn't show up at the retreat, like maybe to give a Dhamma talk or maybe to give instructions one day or whatever it was. And he felt that they could do what they needed to do. And he would, I remember he assigned some of the teaching to Joseph, who he hadn't gone there to become a teacher, he would, but that's what would happen. People walked away feeling, yes, I can. Munindra says I can. That's really big. And it wasn't about following a very strict line. It was more about, he had such enormous faith in the Dhamma that he trusted the Dhamma would do its work on the student and it would be okay. That's how deeply confident he was and how much he trusted students. Now, that's not to say he didn't correct them when necessary. He did. He was very forthright. If you were doing X and he didn't think that was helpful, he would let you know.
Mm-hmm.
But he had tremendous trust and confidence. And I think that the teachers, the people who became teachers, the students who became teachers, they felt his loving kindness. They felt his confidence and trust, and they felt that he didn't have a need to be authoritarian with them. And I think that was big because Westerners, especially at that time, were so disgusted with the authorities who lied to them.
Right.
That it was really big how Munindraji taught and how he related to the students. The other thing is, he didn't put a barrier between himself and his students. He palled around with them. He was in the bazaar with them. He was having chai with them. Not all teachers would do that. But that was, as an Anāgārika, he could do that. And many people said to me, I learned more from hanging out with him than in the meditation hall.
Mm-hmm.
Because he was a walking embodiment of the Dhamma.
Mm-hmm.
In the book, each chapter refers to a particular quality that one needs to cultivate on the path of Dhamma toward awakening. And the anecdotes I share are how people perceive that quality in Munindraji, whether they were in the bazaar or at a flea market in the US or at a train station. They just observed all these different qualities, whether it was loving kindness or patience or, mindfulness was always there, or it was compassion, or his resoluteness, adhitthana. So they learned a lot just from hanging around with him. And most teachers didn't hang around with students. They held a higher position. And he stayed, he didn't sit up on a dais, whatever. He taught them by living his life in front of them, which is very different from just sitting up front and giving instructions or giving a Dhamma talk. He showed them what it's like to be an embodiment of Dhamma in daily life. And that was huge for Western students, that kind of integration.
Yeah, it's very powerful, and it really stands out describing the softness in which he approached the practice, because I think of different teachers and different meditation teachers today, as well as how they've presented the Dhamma in writing or in talks. And the emphasis so much is on the difficulty of the path and the earnestness and the effort and the lack of slacking, not letting awareness go for even a moment. And this could be very inspiring language to hear, almost like a coach in a game who's telling you to the key critical play that you need to be at your best and kind of kicked into gear. But it is a long path. It's a marathon and not a sprint.
Mm-hmm.
And there are other ways it needs to be approached than that, than the full on intensity of of a momentary a reminder from moment to moment of yet again how difficult and strenuous this is, and bringing that to bear. And it's and certainly that's not to criticize that. That's there are times, there are people, there are practices where that is exactly what the student needs to hear. But it's also it's very comforting to hear that that's not the only way, and to hear a teacher that is able to guide students towards the same direction, but using different language and appealing to different kinds of personalities and characteristics. And this brings us to looking at this relationship he had with his Western students in India. And then as the years start to pass, this changes from this kind of informal, amorphous spiritual community that's just forming spontaneously in India to this attempt through the Goenka organization, as well as through others that are going their own way, to want to find ways to to create a format that can then be exported and brought to the West to their own friends and family and community. And the Goenka mission takes off in its own way, but then Munindra students, though some of his students are actually become leaders in the Goenka organization, so they trend more towards those organizational structures, whereas others start to, such as Joseph and perhaps others you want to bring up, start to chart their own teaching careers independently, which eventually takes the shape of buying the land that becomes IMS, Insight Meditation Society, and that becomes a more permanent place. This is a movement of from east to west, and also the ground level of the mindfulness movement that we all know now, that is has become integrated into so many parts of our Western life. But this is really the beginning of this process, and Munindra is involved in it in many ways, directly and indirectly. So as this move starts to happen, as this shift starts to take place, what can you tell us about what how Munindra was involved, and how he was involved directly, as well as how those that he was imparting these lessons to and that he was helping in, perhaps in this indirect fashion, how they then took up this cause as well, which would have his imprint on it in some way.
Well, I'd like to go back to when Munindraji was leaving Burma. I think I mentioned hundreds of people came to the dock to see him off. The fact that he was bringing the Dhamma back to India, there was a belief in Burma that this would happen, that Munindraji was helping to fulfill a prophecy that 2,500 years after the Parinibbana, Buddhism would spread, the Dharma would spread. So Munindraji goes back to India, and then he winds up meeting all these Westerners. And then all these Westerners spread the Dhamma through Australia, New Zealand, South America, North America, Europe. So he was part of something. How could he have even known when he was a little boy in that Bengali village that all of this would come to pass? But he was part of that. And by teaching the Westerners, and they're being so inspired that they went back to the West and started teaching. And, Sharon and Joseph and Jack Kornfield and Jacqueline Schwartz Mandel started IMS. Later Spirit Rock was developed, and other centers from there. Munindraji came to the West whenever his students invited him. He came and taught wherever he was invited, whether it was in Europe or the United States or Australia, he would come and teach. He was so happy to do that. And then his students just kept spreading the Dhamma. And of course, things changed. Mindfulness was taken up as a health practice. And then there were all these, how the materialization or commercialization of Buddhism took hold in the West. But Munindraji was true to his students. He kept teaching. He kept traveling to teach. And then in India, in Bodh Gaya, one of his students, two of them decided, what if we start a Buddhist studies program? And he said, if you do that, I will support you. And so they created a Buddhist studies program abroad through Antioch. And every year, students would come. They had a teacher for Tibetan Buddhism, they had a teacher for Zen Buddhism, and they had Munindraji for Theravadan Buddhism. And unless he was ill or unless he was out of the country, he faithfully showed up every year to teach the students in the program. And I interviewed a lot of those students. He made a huge difference in their lives. Even long after they had spent time with him and after he died. In difficult moments, they would remember something about him, something he said, or his smile. He was a joyful person, so he smiled a lot. And it just kept spreading. He spread the Dhamma in the West himself and through his students, and then he kept spreading the Dhamma in Bodh Gaya through the Western college students who came for the program.
Right. Yeah, I've definitely spoken to many people who've enjoyed that program as well. And then also just looking at this informal way that he was teaching in India, this took on a more formal component. Um, in some ways formal, in some ways it branched into commercial, and as you mentioned, in some ways the lines became a bit blurred. That would be a topic for a much longer conversation. But in that formal development, it rather than just having this informal association of spiritual talks and Dhamma practice, it became something a bit more structured. And of course, the Goenka tradition did its own thing, but IMS was the main platform for a lot of the early practice in the West, located in Massachusetts. So, in what ways was he encouraging the development of IMS and the teachers such as Sharon Salzberg, Jack Kornfield, Joseph Goldstein, among others, that were starting to take part and teach there, as well as the other teachers they were bringing in?
Yes, and as I said, he came and taught wherever he was invited. Because I remember, well, I'll go back to what you were asking. He participated to the extent that he was asked to. And the development that you talked about, the structural development, that was really necessary because we don't have Bodh Gaya in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
That was a time and a place where few people could gather around him. But in the US, how are you going to share the teachings when you have so many people? And to do it one-on-one the way Munindraji did would be very challenging, very limiting. So setting up the retreats, getting a building, was all experimental. Nobody knew that this was going to happen, but it was experimental, and things changed over the years, and other teachers came through. But he was instrumental in the beginning, for sure. So was Deepama. And I think lending his support was huge. He encouraged people. As I said before, he trusted and had confidence in people. And Dipa Ma did that too. And you may know the story about Sharon's getting ready to leave India, and Dipa Ma tells her, "You will be a teacher. You will teach." She said, "No, I won't." And Dipa Ma says, "Yes, you will. You will teach." "No, I won't." And Sharon was very young at the time. She couldn't imagine being a Dhamma teacher, but look at her now. So I think the confidence that Munindraji showed in these young Westerners made a huge impact. And look at the results. Thousands and thousands of people have come through IMS and Spirit Rock and other places. I've watched over the decades how the practice has widened, penetrated communities that were not on board initially. I was on retreat recently, and there were all these young people there, and I was so happy. I was thinking, oh, this is great. All these young people are interested in the Dhamma. And I thought back, oh, that used to be me, the younger generation on the retreat. Now I'm the older generation on the retreat. The fact that all these decades later, that there is so much interest, then it's so hard sometimes to get in on a retreat. I'm often in the lottery and I don't get in, or I'm on a wait list, and then sometimes I get off the wait list and often I don't. And I think, wow, this has been burgeoning for all these decades, all because Westerners showed up. And not only Munindraji, I mean, there were monks in Thailand who were very influential, but all these people showed up, and Munindraji was there to talk with them, to welcome them, to teach them. And again, he was not the only one, but he was there so early on, 1966. So he didn't have anything to do with the buildings. He didn't have anything to do with, how things have evolved. But he always showed up when asked. And people got a flavor of living a life of Dhamma by just being around Munindraji. There was a funny story in the book about a couple of people taking him to a flea market in Massachusetts. Munindraji had a penchant for shopping. It was hilarious, actually. And he went over to one table in the flea market, and there was this little piano toy. And he asked the man behind, how much he wanted. And he said $10. And he said, "Oh, no. Okay, will you take 5?" He said, "No way." And Munindraji says, "Oh, this is for the children of India." This is, he would just go on and on like that whenever he was trying to get a deal. And this man, whom you would not have expected to respond to Munindraji, but he went under the table, he started rummaging around, and he brought up some batteries and the piano, and he said, "Okay, $5 and I'll throw in the batteries." And Munindraji, right then and there, started chanting metta to this man. And the man was so taken aback. And he said, "Oh, yes, we need this. We really need this." And again, this was not a Dharma student. This was not a meditator. He was actually kind of a rough guy. And then a woman at the next table there in the flea market she turns around and she sees Munindraji standing there in his white robes and his white cap. And she says, "Oh, for God's sakes, Gandhi is here." Just couldn't believe the scene that they were having.
Mhm.
And so these two students were watching Munindraji. Yes, he was bargaining. That's what you do in India. You never just accept the first price. And he thanked the man by giving him a blessing of metta. And so, just hanging out with him, going to a place as ordinary as a flea market, you get to learn a lot.
That's a great story, and I'm really glad that you shared that moment of going to the retreat and seeing all these young faces, and it just kind of brings it full circle. And that was, I want to integrate that anecdote into a moment to reflect on and examine his legacy, because it strikes me that as you're there at that retreat, many people, young or of an older age, who go to their first retreat or even their 10th retreat don't necessarily know where this came from, how the
Mm-hmm.
sausage got made, how the decisions came down to structure teachings and physical buildings and the particular way that they show up, they learn, they practice, and they're grateful and go home. And as you're here at this retreat, because of your awareness, your background and experience and research, you're aware that to some degree, the experience you're having there, I don't want to say that it wouldn't have happened without Munindra, or that he was the key driver in manifesting and making this possible, because of course it's much more complicated than that. But I think it would be fair to say that the particular ways that this experience was being shaped, things would be different if he wasn't around. It's
Mm-hmm.
hard to exactly imagine how, because that's a thought experiment, a parallel reality. But certainly there's this kind of unseen influence that he has. And I say unseen because, I think if you're in the Goenka tradition, you learn very early on the gratitude and the awareness you have of Goenka and the lineage and how it came to you. Or if you take a retreat with Joseph Goldstein or any of the others, you're grateful to that teacher. And maybe you hear something about their experiences of how they got there, or even a teacher that Joseph has trained. You might learn under them, but then be aware that um, that that these other kind of bigger name teachers are there looming in the background in terms of what they've given. But I'm not sure to what extent Munindra is really known today. I think that people who know. I mean, that's for
Mm-hmm.
sure. Like people who have done their reading or have had their experiences know. But there have been many meditators I've talked to that are pretty knowledgeable and have been around for a long time and don't have never heard of him before, or maybe have some vague understanding. I would put myself in that category a few years ago. He was always this name that was kind of looming that I never quite understood. That was like, wait, he was friends with Goenka, but he was a Mahasi practitioner, and he taught Joseph Goldstein, so he's a teacher, and just kind of like, that's okay, and just not quite knowing where to place him. And so as you think about his legacy today, not just in a personal way in terms of how he's impacted you or how he's impacted some of these other names we've talked about, but just when we think about it from a legacy standpoint, and I guess I'm asking you this thought experiment, which is hypothetical, so we can't really know for sure with that caveat. But as you think about the way that these meditation teachers and traditions have grown up, the way they've taken shape, and the courses and structures they're now delivering, and you think of where Munindra fits in to this dynamic in ways that many people that are now benefiting would really not know, would really not understand. Hopefully, many of them are listening right now. Let's assume they are. And if you were speaking to some of those individuals who have a practice and who've benefited from this Dhamma experience, but don't really know this background or history, how would you explain to them where Munindra fits into this whole thing?
Well, first, I want to backtrack to how this came to be, writing this book. And that was, I was on a forest refuge retreat, forest refuge at IMS. And one day I was sitting in the meditation hall, and I thought somebody said out loud, who is honoring Munindraji's legacy in the Dhamma. And I thought I had heard someone say that, but nobody had. It was a silent meditation hall. And I thought, where is that coming from? And so after the retreat ended, I went to talk with Joseph. I said, who is honoring Munindraji's legacy? Is anybody working on a book? And he said, not that I know of. So I went home and I called my Dhamma sister, Kamala Masters, which is, by the way, how I first met Munindraji, because he used to come and stay at her house on Maui, and I lived on Maui at the time. I called her and I said, Kamala, is anybody writing a book about Munindraji? And she said, no, but there's a guy who I think maybe did some interviews with him. And she told me about Robert Pryor, who started the Antioch Buddhist Studies Education Abroad program. So anyway, long story short, Robert and I started collaborating. And I tell you this because it was astonishing to me that nobody had written a book about him. He was a very important figure in the Dhamma coming to the West. And I thought, okay, so I started working on it, but I also asked myself, I wasn't one of his early students in Bodh Gaya. I hadn't started practicing yet. As I said, Goenka was my first teacher in India. And I wondered why nobody else had written a book. And then I thought, well, okay, I'll start working on it. And I got help from Robert and from Kamala. And I interviewed probably around 200 people around the world. And we didn't have FaceTime or Zoom then, so I had to call people. And I thought, he presented a particular way of walking the path. And he influenced so many people who are teaching us also how to walk the path of Dhamma. And it surprised me that there was nothing, no book, no anything really. There was maybe one article. And I hope that more and more people will learn about Munindraji's inspiration and influence and impact on the Dhamma that we have today in the West through this book. And to get a sense of, as Munindraji put it, living the life fully. And that means not just sitting in retreat, not just sitting in a meditation hall. It's about living every moment of our lives. He was a great example of living your daily life mindfully, with loving kindness, with compassion, etc. So I believe his legacy is critical or crucial in terms of the Dhamma coming to the West. I have no idea what would have happened had Joseph and Sharon and so many other people not met him. I mean, he opened the door for so many people. He opened the door and said, come on in. Here, taste this. Taste the Dhamma. Even when people were not interested. There was one fellow who went to see Munindraji as a favor to somebody else because he was sick and couldn't come and teach the Antioch program that year. And Munindraji said, oh, okay, why don't you come and stay with me and I will teach you. And the guy was not interested. He wanted to go sightseeing in Calcutta. And he said, okay, well, just come for the weekend. No. And he said, well, okay, just stay overnight. No. And the guy kept refusing, even though Munindraji, as sick as he was, wanted to share the Dhamma. At that point, Munindraji said, "Okay, sit down. I will feed you." And he carefully fed this young man. And the young man was just so moved that he tried to share the Dhamma with him by teaching in a certain way, maybe how to meditate. But the only way he could teach him was by giving dana, by showing generosity. And that had a huge impact on this man, who did eventually go on to practice. Just something so simple.
Yeah.
Just something so simple. And I think that's a big part of his legacy, that it's not simply about sitting with your legs crossed in a silent meditation hall. It's about how you live every moment and how you relate to other people and how you relate to yourself. He was very big on teaching Westerners that they also had to express self-love. He found, just like the Dalai Lama did, that Westerners had so much self-negativity. He didn't understand it himself. So by being so loving, he was just trying to reflect back to them, yes, you are lovable. And I think his approach, his kindness, his softness, and his softness was not to be equated with, like mealy-mouthed or ineffective. He was diligent. He was energetic. He was enthusiastic. He was on the mark. But he wasn't punitive. And I think that his soft, embracing way really endeared so many Westerners to him, but not just Westerners. He had Indian students too. He had Burmese students. And we didn't talk about them at all, but he did, and he had a huge impact on them. That's what I think his legacy is.
And just ask one final question here, and looking at bringing his background into contemporary times, you referenced how the Dhamma has taken shape in the West as it's gone in many different directions, setting up formal entities where before things were casual. And it was that necessitated that, as you mentioned, Bodh Gaya was a very specific time and place of occurrence that needed to expand beyond that. Also the commercial forms, which the Mick mindfulness, which is again a whole other discussion of how that progression and movement has carried on. But sticking specifically with Munindra himself, if he were to come and look at the shape of practice today, which of course is not monolithic, it's not one thing, it's taken so many different forms, from corporate and military settings of people practicing just a little bit of anapana to be able to balance their mind, to on one extreme to perhaps the other extreme, foreigners who've become lifelong committed monastics and in Asian settings and have become teachers in their own right and spent years and years studying up to that point, and then everything in between, all those different shapes and varieties it's taken as it's expanded, as is probably not surprising for any kind of ideological or technical based practice as it moves, that it just starts to take on different forms and needs of that society and blend with local cultures and understanding. And so I understand it's not one thing. There's so many forms that this has taken on, but he passed away before this movement really took off in the way it did. There was a growing and dedicated interest and curiosity from a small segment. But even in the past number of decades, past number of years, meditation has gone from being kind of a fringe, weird, new age thing to something that is pretty normal and common, like any, maybe someone being vegetarian, is weird back in the day. And now it's just kind of like, oh, you're coming over for dinner, like anything you can't eat. It's just kind of something normal that you you accommodate people in the society. So, as this movement and shape has taken on so many different characteristics, if Munindra were to look at the landscape today, do you have any thoughts on how he might feel about it?
Yes, I do actually. He was such a tolerant person, non-judgmental, that I couldn't imagine he would be anything but delighted to see how much the Dhamma has spread. But I'll give you an example of his, let's see, he was aware of the fact that the Dhamma had to adapt, Dhamma practice had to adapt to different cultures. One time, he was with a teacher who had learned from Goenka, and she was chastised for incorporating walking meditation, and she went to talk with him about it. And he said, yes, you are dealing with a different population. You're dealing with people in a different culture. Yes, it is important to adapt. So he didn't say to her, he didn't say to her, oh, you shouldn't do that. You should just follow strictly what Goenka told you to do. He saw that she was trying to make the practice as openly possible to others, and saw the need for having the walking meditation as well. And I think he would probably say something like that today, looking at how many retreats are fairly lenient. He knew what he had to do. He was very diligent, but he didn't criticize people who didn't apply the same determination and energy that he did, and effort. He just saw that everyone had to do it in his or her own way, and at a certain point things would kick in or they wouldn't. And so I imagine if he saw how many people were engaged in learning mindfulness, it would make him happy. He wouldn't judge. I don't think he would judge. He wasn't ever a judgmental person about anything. I mean, think about it. So these hippies are showing up in Bodh Gaya wearing whatever, and the drugs they were doing. He didn't condemn any of them. He just said, oh, tell me about your experience. And he would have them detail minutely their experience, whether they were on LSD or whatever, or a movie that they saw. Even though these were not things he did, he didn't condemn them, and he knew in their own time they would do what they needed to do in the Dhamma. At least that's how I interpret having spent time with him and having learned about him through so many people.
Thank you for that reflection, and thank you for taking all the time today to talk about your work and your experience and time with Munindra. For those people who've never heard of him, I hope that this brings some level of appreciation for those like me several years ago, that it was a floating name that didn't quite know where it fit. Hopefully this is able to center that and to encourage people to go and read your full book, Living This Life Fully, Stories and Teachings of Munindra, which will be linked to the show notes. And for those that knew him and spent time around him, hopefully this brings back the memory and gives some more to share and to remind about who he was and what he did. So thank you so much for taking the time to join and share all these wonderful stories.
And thank you for the opportunity, Joa. I just want to point out that everything I've said is just from me. It's not a categorical knowledge about Munindra. I learned so much about him. I learned more about him through all these people than from the little time that I spent with him. And I'm grateful to all the people who helped me on this project. And thank you again for the opportunity to tell some stories about Munindraji.
Thank you for taking the time to listen to this episode. As regular listeners are aware, we often remind our audience about our nonprofit mission, Better Burma, at the end of a show. Truth be told, fundraising is hard work, and I can personally attest to the fact that it's really no fun to keep asking for contributions. Yet, the situation on the ground now in Myanmar is so distressing that we continue to do so on behalf of the Burmese people. What is most helpful at this time are recurring donations, which help alleviate both the stress and time involved in fundraising. If you are able to pledge a certain amount per month, our team can plan around having at least a consistent minimum amount to work within each month. If you would like to join in our mission to support those in Myanmar who are being impacted by the military coup, we welcome your contribution in any form, currency, or transfer method. Your donation will go on to support a wide range of humanitarian and media missions, aiding those local communities who need it most. Donations are directed to such causes as the Civil Disobedience Movement, CDM, families of deceased victims, internally displaced person IDP camps, food for impoverished communities, military defection campaigns, undercover journalists, refugee camps, monasteries and nunneries, education initiatives, the purchasing of protective equipment and medical supplies, COVID relief, and more. We also make sure that our donation fund supports a diverse range of religious and ethnic groups across the country. We invite you to visit our website to learn more about past projects, as well as upcoming needs. You can give a general donation or earmark your contribution to a specific activity or project you would like to support, perhaps even something you heard about in this very episode. All of this humanitarian work is carried out by our nonprofit mission, Better Burma. Any donation you give on our Insight Myanmar website is directed towards this fund. Alternatively, you can also visit the Better Burma website, betterburma.org, and donate directly there. In either case, your donation goes to the same cause, and both websites accept credit card. You can also give via PayPal by going to paypal.me/betterburma. Additionally, we can take donations through Patreon, Venmo, GoFundMe, and Cash App. Simply search Better Burma on each platform and you'll find our account. You can also visit either website for specific links to these respective accounts or email us at info@betterburma.org. That's Better Burma, one word, spelled BETTERBURMA.org. If you would like to give it another way, please contact us. We also invite you to check out our range of handicrafts that are sourced from vulnerable artisan communities across Myanmar, available at alokacrafts.com. Any purchase will not only support these artisan communities, but also our nonprofit's wider mission. That's Aloka Crafts, spelled ALOKACRAFTS, one word, alokacrafts.com. Thank you so much for your kind consideration and support.